Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. My name is Doug. Thanks for dropping by and seeing what's new in my neck of the woods for stock car racing. Today we're going to talk about tires, racing tires to be sure, but the information that we're going to talk about today is applicable to any kind of tire that's used in racing. A lot of classes require what they call a street tire. They even are very specific to the tread depth, the speed rating that the tire is rated for, and so on. So they know what the limits and the softness of these tires are, even on street tires. So when we talk about the tires that I use, which are in limited late model and late model, we're going to talk about what the tools we use, what they can tell you about your race car, and what to know regarding tires to help set up your car, and the issues with racing tires that we all have to deal with. So we're going to go through that along with the tools that we use and all the bits and pieces that I take into account, at least when I'm racing, and how tires are a big part of how a car handles, or should I say the way we get indications of how the car is handling, and helping us determine what setup changes we need to do to the chassis to go faster. So hopefully that'll be something you're all interested in. And we'll then talk about the mystery tool that I talked about last week. And then if I have time, we'll add another mystery tool to this video. So let's get started. What we have here is just a standard tire, racing tire I should say. In our class in limited late model, we are on an actual race tire designed for racing only. It's not approved for highway use. It has gone through lots of different tests for racing by the manufacturer. In this case, it's Hoosier. And our compound that we use is what they call a 980. For years, we were using a combination of a 960 and 980. It has to do with the type of material and the quality of the blend of the rubber that's used on the racing surface of the tire. This one here is a slick, so there are no grooves. And they're available in a wide variety of sizes within certain means. So this is an 8-inch tire. A lot of the late models run a 10-inch tire, but we run an 8-inch. And they vary in size in inches from 26.5 right up to 28. So the first segment we're going to talk about here is the tools we use. We use a high quality air pressure gauge. This one is a Longacre, very high quality, very good durability. You can see that we've got a custom rubber case around it for banging around on the ground. It's got a good high quality bezel, and the increments are very large and easy to see, and so you're right down to the pound, and it's very accurate. They've all been calibrated as well. This is not your normal air pressure gauge. And I'll show you a good example of that, just from a real cheapie to one of these, what the difference is, which is a big benefit if you really got accuracy in your air pressure. We have measuring tapes, an indicator, a depth indicator on the tire for measuring the amount of depth of left and wear of the tire, because there are tire wear indicators on these, and we'll show you how to use those. Pen for marking on your tire, and then we have we have a stagger gauge as well, because you're going to use different size tires from the inside to the outside of the car, but these have their limitations, so we're going to go through that. And probably the most important tool is your notebook. Tires are very important on a race car. And they're a valuable source of information for oval track racing. It's a little harder to diagnose problems on a road course tire and car, because the left hand, right hand challenges, it could be more lefts than rights or more rights than lefts on a course. The straightaways vary in length, and your setup's different, and therefore what the tire is trying to tell you as indications is a little more difficult. But for this video, we're going to focus on oval track. And the rules, basically, in the sense, the tips that I'm going to give today are the same, whether it's a little third of a mile or a big 1.5 mile track. When you get into the super speedways, 2 miles, 2.5 miles, like Daytona or Talladega or Michigan, the tires are very different on their wear characteristics compared to, say, Bristol. It's the same thing for us. We're running on bull rings of a third of a mile, a quarter of a mile, and then at some invitationals they're 3/8 of a mile. Next year we'll have a brand new racing surface at Cayuga, so it'll be 5/8 of a mile. And the indications on how that tire is performing are going to be different than, say, a short track. But the rules and how we detect what the tire is doing are all basically the same. So the first thing I advise a lot of guys that are getting into racing is, and this applies to mini stock, street stock, Thunder Car, limited late model, pro late, super late, is you've really got to make sure you can document everything. And that's by having a notebook on your car. And we use what we call a setup sheet, and we'll have another video that's dedicated strictly to setup sheets. But I mean, really, you've got to have a log of what your tires doing, your tires in your car are doing. And effectively, it's a really nice, simple setup sheet that you can use. And away you go. And so the option that we're talking about here of documenting something or not documenting is critical. The more you can keep track of your race car and what it's doing, the better off you're going to become at dealing with the changes you need to do to the car. Everything. So as you can see, I'll put some notes together for you guys at the bottom to where you can get these sheets. These ones are made by Longacre again. But you can also do this on computer, which is what I've done. I'll write everything down on a sheet of paper like this for each heat race, each practice, and each race itself, and then put it into computer so I can compare different race dates and everything. Ideally, you just have a general amount of weather information too, how much humidity you think it was in the forecast, the temperature when you raced compared to the heat races, that sort of thing. So this information is very valuable in your chassis sheet when you're documenting what's happening to the tires. I can't stress that enough, and that applies to all classes. So in this style of tire, like I mentioned earlier, it's a slick. Slicks, in this case, this is a bias ply tire. It is not a radial. A lot of late model classes have gone to the Goodyear Eagle. That is a radial. The real difference is just the way the tire is constructed. Bias ply is cheaper, although we don't seem to want to think so. It's expensive going through these tires, and we'll talk about that at the end of the video. But the amount of consistency in these tires really varies. And a lot of that has to do with how fast that racetrack is, the conditions of the track. Is it a green track? Did it rain the previous day? And is the track what we call green? So it's got no rubber down on it. It's going to take a lot of heat to get some grip. And there's also the age of the racetrack as well. If the pebbles are now starting to show through the asphalt, that track's going to be slick. And getting grip of any kind is going to be a lot more difficult. So how you set up the car to how much air pressure you use and the size of the tire that you think you can get to and stay there is going to be difficult. And it won't be solved unless you start and take a lot of notes. And with our cars and with oval, you're definitely going to have some kind of stagger between the inside and outside tires. It is a good idea if you're starting out in racing in this kind to talk to your fellow competitors. They'll at least give you a general ballpark as to where you should be, and there should be a consensus of what you're hearing as to the amount of stagger that they're using. But that doesn't apply to all cars because each one may be a little different. Their shocks and springs, how they react, and therefore how much stagger you really need will vary from car to car. There is a set radius rule, a pi, using pi, on what the inside arc and the outside arc between the inside and outside tires are, and what the total staggered difference between the two are. Because you have track width of a car and the width, and therefore there's two different arcs, and therefore the size difference. The outside tires will do more RPM than the inside tires are. There's an exception to that a little bit, because in our class of racing we tend to use a spool in the rear end, which is a full locked up axle, and therefore the RPM of the inside tire is going to be the same as the outside tire. In our class of racing, for example, Detroit lockers and posi track axles are illegal. You can use an open diff, but they're going to tech you to make sure there is no posi track inside. But I haven't seen an open diff used in limited late model a lot of years in short track, third of a mile, quarter of a mile, half mile. I have seen in the States where they're starting to experiment a lot more with an open diff or open differential, where it's just freewheeling standard gear, no posi track. It doesn't eat up friction, and you have to worry about the different sizes of tires or staggering between the inside and outside. That's becoming a potential game changer in some of the classes that are running the half mile or bigger tracks. In Sprint Cup and in Xfinity, they are allowed Detroit lockers, and therefore the size, the tire difference between the two is a lot less critical than it is in ours. Our cars are lighter too, at 27 to 2,800 pounds. These cars are very sensitive to different size tires, and they'll move around on you, and you got to have a real good feel of what that car is doing based on the amount of stagger you have. Because you get it wrong, that car will either be super tight or super loose, and it's really hard to get that perfect right in the middle. And stagger has a lot to do with that. Same with air pressure. The lower the air pressure in a tire, chances are that it could grow, expand, and add more air pressure from the heat inside the tire as it generates heat from being on the racing surface. The chances are it'll grow are significant. The ones on the outside, if you got a fairly high air pressure number already, you're probably going to reach the limit of what that tire's capability of PSI is recommended for. In this case, this is an older 980. The maximum PSI they want you to run is 40. But typically, to bead the tires and everything else, we go up to 50 pretty quick, 50 PSI, and then we bring it right back down to 40. But there are some tricks we can tell you. We don't necessarily condone them. There is safety warnings. There's very clear disclaimers by Hoosier what the maximum PSI of these tires are, which is 40. But we see it all the time that's happening in the pits, where they're blowing these tires up to 50, leaving them out in the sun. Hopefully tire expands to the new size to get the proper width that they want. And then they bring it down to a racing trim of anywhere from the right side tires at 20 to 26, sometimes even 30. And then on the inside tires, the PSI of the pressure of the tires will vary between 14 and 22. Again, it depends. The front tires are a little more different in the sense that the tire pressures that they use, the right front does most of the work compared to the left front. That tire is stressed for braking, turning, and being the heaviest load on that part of the car is at the right front, particularly in the corner, and you're turning at the same time. It has a lot of responsibility, so to speak. But if you have a well set up car, the amount of load and work that the tire should do between all four, it should be no more than 10% different between the inside tires and outside tires as to the workload, if you do it right, or relative to the weight that the car is set up for. I mentioned in my previous videos that we do have rules on left side weight and front to rear weight. That does affect how we set up the car for weights at all four corners of the car. The right front, left front, so on, right rear, left rear. And therefore, how you set your car up for air pressure and size is important too. The front difference, the front tires on Stagger between the left front and right front, not as critical as the back tires. And that's because obviously they're not connected by a drive mechanism. But it is good to set the stagger to some degree, because that's how you're going to set the car coming into the corner, When the front end starts diving, you ideally do not want to have a huge offset where the car is rolling over or diving too much into the left, because otherwise the car will get loose and probably spin around on you. The same for the rear. You got to be very careful, as I mentioned, about radius of track and the power that you have. If the tire is too small on the inside and too big on the outside of the car, that inside tire is going to spin, and it's not going to get traction. Again, it depends on the radius of the racetrack, how much banking there is, etc. The general rule is the higher the banking of the track, the less stagger you're going to need. But it also depends, as I mentioned, the radius, how tight that racetrack's corners are. The tighter the radius, the more stagger you're probably going to want. The less amount of radius, the wider arc that the turns are, the less stagger you're going to need. Those are basic general rules. With the measuring and how we set up these tires on the car, as I mentioned, weight's a big factor of that, and the spring setup along with the shocks, and the way the driver actually enters the entry into the corner and exits the corner has a huge impact, obviously, on how well these tires will perform, what their wear rate is, and how well they'll actually do what they're supposed to do, which is grip. So with that, a good example of that is that we mentioned tools earlier that are really important to this. We're going to talk about that now in the way we do that. And a good example of that is how to measure a tire's width. This is a Stagger gauge. It's made by a lot of different manufacturers. Longacre's one, All-Star's another. And effectively, it has increments based on measurement here of what the tire width should be. And you're going to figure out what the width and the diameter of the tire is, not the width, but the diameter, sorry. And you're going to measure it. Now, when you're measuring tires, I've seen it done both ways. I've done it both ways, whether the tire is on the ground or off the ground. The more accurate method for the actual diameter of the tire is to get the car off the ground and measure that way. And then either use a measuring tape or a Stagger gauge. But these things are not as accurate as a lot of people think they are. Or the bigger problem is that these arms eventually will get bent. Wear and tear, banging around in the grass and the gravel and so on, and being dropped and so on. These arms eventually will bend. And that's difficult to, you can't even tell really whether it's bent or not. But I'll give you a good example. So this tire here, you measure from the center of the tire of the rim, and you're going to take an indication here of what this is. And in this case, this one's just under 81 3/4. And you just got to be careful. You're gonna have to make sure you're not getting any rocks or anything on the sides of your tires. Make sure you're getting an accurate reading. Some guys will they'll mark the tire using a marker, and they'll always measure stagger from the same points. They'll make a custom line here. That's where they want the stagger to be measured all the time. And that's just to get consistency in your stagger measurements, because it can vary from, sometimes there are imperfections in these tires, or they're a little out of balance. So they mark where they're going to measure that stagger every time. And so you get a measurement. And this one, in this case, is 81 3/4. And we rarely get tires that size. This one's an older tire. It's certainly, we normally get tires that vary in size between 84 and 87. But this one's old, it's shrunk. But let's use the measuring tape now and go all the way around. Again, this is the circumference of the tire. We'll just come around this way here. You're not going to be able to necessarily see this. But, yep, there it is. Sure enough, down here. We'll see if I can get the camera lower here for you. I don't know if you can see that, but sure enough, it's at 82 rather than the 81 3/4. So there's a 1/4 inch difference between the two measuring devices. In fact, I got this measuring upside down. I'll do it again for you. Do it the upside right. And again, you want to make sure you're measuring Make sure the measuring tape is around the center all the way around so that you're not making any inaccuracies. And you're going to come around and you're going to measure it, and sure enough there it says 82. So whatever method you pick, you got to stay consistent. You can't use measuring tape on one side of the car and then a stagger gauge on the other. Or otherwise you won't get an accurate difference or reading of what the difference between the tires is. And that's how we measure tires. And you're going to measure them when they're cold, when you first put them on the car, and you're going to measure them when they're hot, as soon as you get off the racetrack, between heat races, practice, and then ideally after the race to see how well it performed. And did it expand, did it shrink, or did it stay where you set it? The next thing you're going to do is you're going to measure its air pressure. And again, I mentioned you want a really good gauge to do that. And you're going to do it when the tire air pressure is cold and when it's hot. And in this case, this has a needle stop, so you put it in there. You don't have to worry about reading it. It'll stay right where you had it for air pressure. In this case, it shows 23 right in the button. Okay. And then you just hit this little button here and it can release it. That's why they're a little more expensive. They're a very good gauge. Air gauge for your compressor, that sort of thing. I can guarantee you it's going to be a different reading. And it's not going to be accurate because there's no calibration for it. And in fact, this one says 24. That may not seem like a lot, but it is. And I've actually found with this gauge that the higher the air pressure, the more discrepancy there is. And then you've got, you know, your little, the ones that you see sometimes mechanics working around and they put it into the tire. We really try to avoid those with racing tires. So, because they're just not accurate enough for our needs. We do want right down to the half pound if we can, and then we document it. Okay guys, so now we're going to start determining the condition of this tire. Just like you would during a heat race after you've completed it. Heat races vary from 5 to 10 laps depending on the track. And you're going to do this also during practice. You're going to try to figure out what the tire is doing relative to the setup that you have in the car. So the first thing that I'm going to do after measuring it is I'm going to check the depth using the depth indicator on these tire grooves, which you can see right here. And we're going to mark it down on our sheet. We can do that. We can check the depth. We can make a little place here what the depth is if you want, right below the tire temperature. But as you can see, we've got everything for the setup of the car, the cold and air pressures and so on. I'll make a link to this this product at Longacre if you want. And again, this is a really important tool, and you can make little notes again like we talked about earlier. So first thing we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to check the depth of these tire wear mark indicators across the tire. Now this particular tire, in fact, is a right front. So looking this way, the tire is angled in like this on a camber. This is exaggerated, but in fact it's not too bad actually. That's some of the camber we use at some tracks, and that's why there's a lot of rubber buildup here. And so we'll measure across, you know, through the holes, and this has a little slot matching the same slots in the tire indicator. And so we'll make sure it's lined up, and we'll go in, and this is just over 5/30 seconds. As you can see there's a little mark, and you can see where the 5 is there, so just a hair about 5 roughly in 30 seconds of an inch. But you can notice there's different sizes of the angles here you can check across so you can get a proper measurement. So you'll go across just gently down, and there's the 4 side of 30 seconds of an inch, and there's where the 6 is. So it's right between the two. These are metric on the other side. And you record that. So this is the outside of the tire. And we're going to come down through again and make sure we're going to get through the slot. Make sure it's all the way down there. Level across. and this one is now about it's less than 4. In between, it's about 3. You can see there's the mark. Go across again. Make sure it's in the groove, flat at the bottom. This is about the same. Just a little above 3. We'll just double check that. Yeah, so that's actually 430, just under 430 seconds. Here's the inside of the tire. And that again too is just below the 430 seconds mark. So almost 3, but you can see where 1 is there and there's 3, so it's just above that. So this is wearing more on the inside, which it should, because of the camber. And if anything, we probably had a little too much camber on this tire. But what also indicates how well that tire is doing is the tire temperatures across the tire. So you'll use your tire temperature gauge to check that. So with the tire temperature gauge, you're going to measure across the tire. So in this case, it's obviously this is not off the track. It's cold. It's measuring 63 on the inside, 64.9. It should be fairly even right across right now, but you can see there's still but minor variations. And that can be also based on the thickness of the tire that's left. But generally speaking, on a tire like this, if it's operating properly, the insides are probably about 185 to 190 degrees. In the middle, it should be around the same, within 5 degrees of that, so 180 to 185. And the outside, because it's going to be the coolest with the less amount of traction, this will be probably between 170 and 175. Ideally, though, if you got the camber just right as the car squats down, entry into the corner, the tire temperatures right across from inside to middle to outside should be no more than 10 degrees apart. The ideal operating temperature of these tires during racing is about 200 degrees, 190 to 200 degrees. It depends on the time of year, though. If you've got a real cold track, you won't get to those temperatures. But if you get extreme hot in the summer, I've seen tires go up to 205, 210, no problem. And they can take it, but that tire will wear. The hotter it is, the faster it's going to wear out. So be aware of that. The other thing we're going to do is use a durometer gauge. This is a tire durometer. That's a Type A. It runs off the ASTM 2240 spec. It's made by Intercomp. It's a very good little gauge. Just make sure it's zeroed out, and then you're going to measure across the tire very quickly. I'll see if I can make that a little easier for you to see, but going off the top, that gauge is probably too far away. But you can tell what the increments are. Up to 100 is fairly hard. 30 is extremely soft. We never get the tires to 30. Not this compound anyways. But your best compound softness on these tires when they're fresh and they're kept well is between 40 and 50. If you can get in that range, that's a pretty soft and sticky tire. So we'll measure across what this is. So in this case, when you're measuring, you go in and plunge it into the tire, not the tire indicator grooves, but across the surface of the tire, and plunge it very quickly and hold it there, and you'll get the first measurement, and then it starts bringing back. That means that it's already starting to retract the needle. So what you want to do is, again, just quickly go in, find a nice flat surface, look at the number, and go across the tire. So in this case, in the middle is 70, 68. Do it a few times if you feel it's not giving you a reading that you like in the sense of accuracy. 68 again. Looks like 68 again there too. I got 66 that one time. 66. 66 again. And like I say, this is a fairly old tire. It's just a setup tire that I use in my car now. And effectively, this tire is pretty much done. If I ran this tire for practice, I could probably clean it up and it'll get back into the 50s during when it's operating at hot temperatures. But a new tire, for example, when you scuffed it in and practicing it, it should be durometering between 40 and 50, no problem. As the tire hardens, though, the numbers are going to get higher. They're going to be in the 80s, and so that tire will have very little grip as it gets harder. A lot of teams also check the sidewalls, so they'll measure the sidewalls well. And this is a really good indicator of just how hard the tire is going to be. It can be misleading because the sidewall construction is fairly thick. It has to support the bead of the rim and everything else, and it's not a really good indicator of overall softness of the tire. But it is an indicator of how well the sidewalls are holding up. And so when you first get the tire, you measure the sidewall, and again, you're going to use marks that I showed earlier and keep it consistent. It's the same with your durometer and your the tire. Pick specific spots. Ideally, if you can do 4 sets, so just do like so, and then get consistent in measuring that. And so it's not critical you get a durometer tire reading right away after you come into the pits. Do your tire temperatures and your stagger, the measurement of the tire first. Those are the 2 critical pieces of information you're going to want. But this is a really good indicator of the health of the tire. But again, I'll do the sidewall above the bead line of the mold, the casing mold, and I'll come in here and I'll just check it, and it tells me the health of that tire because it's never been run on. And in this case, it's about 74. So you can tell this tire is getting fairly old. But if I wanted to, I'll go practice with it, and I'll put the durometer reading here and see if it's softened up from the heat. It should, but it shouldn't, it should not soften extensively because it's not hitting the surface of the track. And it just gives you a good health indicator, an indicator of the health of the tire. This is a very valuable tool. You got to make sure it's zeroed out, and you want to, again, make sure that when you're plunging into the tire to check your durometer reading, make sure it's a clean surface where you're measuring, and do the outside, middle, outside, and it'll give you an idea. Obviously, if this is cambered in and this is getting most of the work, this should be durometering very soft, a little harder, and hard, relatively speaking. So the numbers should be in the 40 to 44, 45, somewhere maybe just as close as the inside because it's still getting most of the surface. And this one might be durometering 46 to 50. But it depends on the type of tire. There are lots of different compounds that Hoosier, American Racer, Goodyear use. American Racer is now owned by Hoosier. But again, they use different compounds based on the rules of your track. The treaded tires that are used in street stock, same rules apply in the sense of how to check your durometer and your sidewalls and your circumference. But they are harder to read, meaning more difficult. And that's because the compounds they use are automatically right off the bat, they're a harder compound. And so, getting the fine details and getting consistent what they really mean relative to the racetracks that you run and keeping your notes, it's going to be a little more difficult because they may not indicate how well the car is working or not, at least with durometers and tread, mainly because of the fact that your tread depth is not a specific series of holes, but it's going to be your lines here, and it's going to vary the tread indications of that. And again, this is where it would be critical to mark where you're doing your indications so you're getting consistent readings. Don't just pick any old spot because one particular part of the tire might be a little softer than the other. You want to be consistent at least where you're taking your indications and your readings. And so from there, the thing to look for on the front tires, again, is based on camber. So if this was a left front tire, then I'm probably going to have the camber pushed out. And again, it's because I want, as I'm going around the corners of the racetrack, as the car compresses, comes down on the suspension, it's going to even out a bit. and then that's where I'm gonna get maximum grip. If I just have the tire straight up going into the corner, the tire's gonna wanna roll over on its sidewall. So I'm gonna camber it out a little bit, and when again the suspension comes down, it's gonna get as fairly flat as possible. Also on the inside left front, that's usually where the least amount of banking on the racetrack is, unless you're driving the outside lane. But the same rule still applies. The left side tires don't have to be cambered as much as, say, the rights. But it's a balance. You'll have to discover that, and your tire temperatures will tell you if you got enough camber or too much. If this is the left front and this is getting extremely hot and this is extremely cold, that tells you that there's probably too much work being done on the inside of this tire, and you need to take some of that camber out and bring it a little more level, and that means that you'll get more grip out of this side. It simply is a way to tell whether you've got the suspension working. You may need a softer or a stiffer spring. You may need to adjust what kind of shock you're using on compression rebound, and also the amount of weight distribution. All of these things come into play. But the camber is the most active one to indicate how well the tire is gripping the racetrack surface. If this is a right front and you've got it this way, then again you're going to be cambered in. And again, as the car straightens out going to the corners, the car's diving. Again, you're in the driver's seat from your view right now. That tire is going to want to straighten out. And just like I was saying before, on the left, you're going to have, this will be the hottest part of the tire, medium, and of course this should be the coldest. But again, you'll be able to tell if this is excessively hot. If this is 190 degrees and this is 160 degrees, that 30-degree temperature variation is probably too much, and that tells you that this tire is going to, one, wear out very quickly on the inside. Two, the tire is not balanced correctly to the race car to distribute the load and the work that the tire has to do for grip. And you're losing traction because of the fact you're not using the full advantage of the footprint of the tire. Usually that's a good indication whether the car is pushing if you've got too much camber. If you don't have enough camber, then of course there will be none of this excessive build up, and you'll notice there's no build up here, and as a consequence you may be rolled over too much, and you may need to add camber back in by pulling the control arm in with shims and pulling this in, and vice versa for the control arm on the left. If you've got, again, on the left front, and again if this is angled in and if this is doing too much work, then you may find that you need to pull it back, again add shims. But if it's too flat and it's rolling over and this side showing like no wear here like it is here, and if this was a left front, chances are that this is starting to roll over a little bit much and you'd have tire buildup on the outside, then you know you probably don't have enough outward camber on the tire to work, and therefore you need to add shims to your control arm, push the upper control arm out on the spindle, and add some more. And again, the buildup will be a reasonable indicator, but the tire temperatures and the depth indications on the grooves, or sorry, the tire mark indicators, will give you really good clues as to how well that tire is working on the racetrack. So the other thing to be aware of, again, using your tire temperature gauge, is if you've got too much air pressure, the inside, the middle, will be too hot. And if these are, again, getting cold, you've probably got too much air pressure in that tire. The other thing to be aware of, though, is with air pressure after a race or after a heat race or practice, again, the tire growing. And if the air pressure is too high in the first place and it starts expanding, then you know that the stagger is going away. And you've got to be careful with the growth of the tire, particularly on the rear tires. If this was a left rear and on the inside, and I measured, like I say, 82 inches, and I want 3 inches of stagger relative to what I think the track is going to be able to take, I would have an 85-inch circumference tire on the right rear. And often what happens is this tire most often it does not do as much work as the right rear does if this is the left rear. And you're trying to equalize that out, balancing the setup. You want to, obviously the left side tire to do as much work as possible with the drive tires. And if this tire is growing, then you lose your stagger, then that car is also going to push. It's still going to want to go straight ahead going into the corner because it's equal. It's not going to help the car turn if you've got this tire becoming the same size as your right rear. And again, you're in the driver's seat, and so if this is the right side tire, and if this was 85 inches and you've lost stagger, and then let's say you went in and the circumference of the tire was 85, and then you came after a practice or after a heat race and it went down to 84 3/4, chances are your air pressure was too low. You need to bring it up, and to keep the air pressure and the stagger diameter of the sort of the circumference of the tire the same, or a little bit more. Ideally, what we're trying to shoot for, of course, is no change in tire. And so you'll have to practice with what the air pressure should be between rights and left tires, the rear and the fronts. And so what we've experienced lately with some of the tires is that you can get a bad tire. It happens. And the tire will shrink no matter what. You staggered it out at 87 inches on the circumference and it still went down to 86 1/4 or even 86. I've seen stagger loss on a right rear tire, go as much as 1.5 inches. It's clear either the tire was leaking air or it simply wasn't getting enough heat. And again, by using air pressure, you'll determine if you started cold, it was at 28 and it only went up to 29, or maybe it went down. Maybe it was only 26 instead of 28, then something's wrong. The tire is not doing its job and getting hot. And you'll verify that with, again, the tire temperature gauge, how hot this tire was getting. If it's not in the 180 plus range, this tire in the right rear probably wasn't doing enough work. If it was the left rear, the same rules apply. If you start with, say, an air pressure of 20 and it went only to 18, that means this tire probably wasn't getting enough traction. I don't know if it'd be spinning, but it certainly wasn't doing enough work if you were losing air pressure. Again, you may have a leak. You're going to have to do the standard little bubble check and your rim check. I've seen rims where they're, press welded here, and if the welds crack, there'll be a small, tiny leak, and it'll happen when the rim gets hot from the heat, from the air pressure inside. If this tire gets warm, remember, these tires are getting to 180 to 190 degrees. That rim's going to get hot as well, and this could be a seam leak. And the only way you're going to be able to detect that is with soap and water. Blow it up to 40 psi, see if there's any leaks through your valve stem or something, and that's when you determine if the rim's any good. And of course, there may be a puncture, a real small seeping hole in the tire itself. But if you don't find anything and you're still having a handling issue, and you're determining that the tire temperatures are not coming up hot enough, or the durometer readings are getting off, you may have simply just a bad tire, or you don't have enough stagger difference between the two, maybe too much, and you've got the wrong air pressure settings. Lots of science and sometimes some guessing what to do properly with these tires, especially the drive tires in the rear. Stagger is not supposed to be used to fix your handling of your car. You should have a good balance set up in your car with shocks, springs, and the weight distribution that the springs will be leveraged using wedge bolts, or sometimes called load bolts. And so you've got to really get a good handle on that. And then your tires will be proof that your setup's going in the right direction. Tire management from the point of view of driving also is a really big deal. If you're in dead last and you're in 30th place and you're trying to go all the way up to the front and you use up your tires by being aggressive on the throttle, passing everybody in the first 5 laps, I can guarantee you at the end of the race that tire is going to be a lot less consistent than at the start of the race, because you've pushed that tire to its very limits. and therefore it's going to be difficult to determine how well your setup is working when the tire is really used up like that by taking tire temperatures and barometer readings and depth gauges, especially in long races. You're not going to be able to learn what was right on the car for handling and what wasn't as easy as it would be with a driver that is consistent with his laps, trying to be still moving forward but taking care of the tire at the same time, because you can abuse these tires very easily. And that's important to know. Driving is a skill, but it's also a bit of an art form. How well this tire is going to be gripping the surface near the end of the race with 5 laps to go. And you do want to make a pass for the top 3 positions. And if you've used the tires up already, there's going to be nothing left. And sure enough, you can't make that pass or dive into the corner as deep as you want before hitting the brakes, because the tire will be used up, it'll be slick. And again, that's why determining how good the condition of the tire is after a long race is not going to be as helpful. In races of 20 to 30 laps, that's what some of these features are. I think some of the racetracks are going to 35 laps, and they're running twin 35s per night. You'll be able to tire manage by getting the right diagnosis of what the tire is doing with using the tools that I've mentioned. And at the end of the race, that's important to really quickly determine how well that tire was operating and getting those readings as fast as you can. When you do come into the pits, I can't emphasize this enough. Check the circumference of the tire with a tape measure. That would be my preference. Jack up the car. First thing you do is measure the circumference of the tires, all 4 of them, and then get a tire temperature reading. Ideally, if you got two crew guys, one's measuring the tires, the other one's getting the tire temperatures. And then you'll come in after all 4 are plotted down on your chart, then you'll come in with a durometer gauge. And then again, this is right after a practice or a heat race or a feature race. And when you set the tires up, what you believe is the right combination of air pressures and stagger, and you're trying to make adjustments, there are 2 schools of thought, but the one that I use and I strongly recommend is when you're making changes to the tire, do it when it's cold. The definition of cold is at least 20 plus minutes in between the last time you ran that tire, whether it's practice or heat race, before you make an air pressure change in the tire, up or down, decreasing it or increasing it. And then of course you're going to want to make adjustments possibly to the front tires for camber as to how much is leaning over. Is it enough? Is it not enough? Something I haven't mentioned quite yet that can be a false flag is if you have too much toe on the front tires. Typically we're running everywhere between an 1/8 of an inch toe out to a 1/4 inch. Some guys are going higher, 3/8. It depends on the radius of the racetrack, and we'll talk about that in another video. But if the toe is not enough or it's too much, that will show indications of wear on the right front tire. If the toe's too much, it definitely will be hotter on the inside, and that could be a false flag if you got too much toe. If it's the left front, then of course, this one's supposed to be straight and you're doing adjustments on the right side. Then of course, this one should be fairly consistent. But if the toe is not enough, if it's straight, chances are the inside of the left front will get hot, particularly in that edge here, probably the first 2 inches of tread or the surface area of the tire might show a little more heat, including the center. So, but it'd be really hot here. It'd be, this might be 205, 210 degrees. If it's a cold night of racing, this might be, say, 185, 190, and then it might be 180, 185 here as well. And if it drops off, and this is a left, then you've probably got too much toe or not enough toe in the car, and it's angled in if this is the left front. So those are some of the basics on how we measure tires. and what they're going to tell us for how well the car is handling. Both setup of the control arms, your toe, your camber, and your weight distribution. All four tires are critical. Don't just measure the fronts and ignore the rears. All of it's important for all four corners. And again, take notes. The way you'll get faster and better with your cars, you've got to document everything and see if you're making progress. And don't do it by memory, because I can guarantee you'll get confused and mixed, especially if you're the driver and looking at it and you're thinking, well, is my car tight? Meaning that I can't turn the car and I can't get onto the throttle fast enough because it still wants to just move forward rather than turn. If it's really loose, the back end wants to feel like it's coming around, you can't get on the throttle. Then again, you can confirm that with your tires. That's a big part of telling you what your car is doing. And I'll talk about tire doping as well. Tire doping is using chemical treatments on the tire to make them soft. Again, a durometer rule will help you get to the target you want with a tire being virgin and just raced, and it'll tell you just how soft it is and how hard it's getting over time. What guys are starting to experiment with is chemicals treated onto the tire. They'll put it into literally a rotisserie where it has a little shaft that goes through the rim, and it'll rotate. You basically got a bath, and you'll rotate the tire through a chemical treatment. Track Claw is one, Tiger Claw. There's lots of different brands out there. Hoosier, American Racer, Goodyear Eagle. They do not recommend it. They don't want the liability, of course. Something goes wrong. Only it's proprietary, as they say, the compounds that are used in the rubber. But the chemical makeup of a tire softener is also proprietary in some ways. They're the ones that are saying, hey, this will soften up your tire, make it grippy without being an oily, slick feel. In some tracks it's legal, in other tracks it's not. There's a famous case in Florida where I'll talk a bit about that in a little bit. And they run on a durometer rule. You just can't have the tire softer than X. I think in this case it was 40 or 42. At our track at Sunset Speedway, they allow doping, so you can soak the tires as much as you want. But there's real dangers in that, in the sense of consistency. We're not chemical engineers as race car drivers, but we're on the idea that we can save money buying an $80 can or $90 can of chemical, doping the tires and making them soft, rather than replacing the tire. And also extending the life of it. Racing is getting expensive. So that's an issue that a lot of race teams are facing. There are supposedly, I've never been through tech with one, but apparently there are tools that can detect whether the tire is doped or not. They're expensive. I know some tracks have them, some tracks do not. And so some tracks, some racetrack technical directors have just said, look, we're not going to test for it. Doping's legal. The flip side of a treated tire is once it's really done and worn out, it really is worn out. Because you changed the chemical composition of that tire. And what the rubber can and cannot do. And I'm really of two minds whether tire doping is effective to save a racer money, or is it a false economy? If a tire in a long invitational race is 100 laps, 150 laps, that set of tires is probably done. I know in the super late class of racing up here in Canada, tire doping is not going to really get you anything, because they're going to bolt on 4 brand new tires to start the race, and at the end of that feature, those tires are done. They're garbage. They might be good for practice just to see how well the car is doing on a setup change, but they're not going to race them for a feature race anymore. They're done. Maybe some of the teams, if they're trying to save money, they might replace just the right side tires for the next race and leave the lefts on. But again, each team's different based on budget. And there's no question, a team that has 4 brand new ones is going to be faster than a guy with used tires. That's just the way it is. And hence why I mentioned earlier about the tire rule that some tracks have. And we'll go into depth about that more later. So that's kind of the first segment of tire management that I'm going to talk about. And we'll talk more about, again, what tires can do, or what their function in a sense on the car is, and the tricks of them as we go forward. And then once I've got the car on the racetrack, I'll try to come back to some of what we've talked about here in the video and what we're seeing at the actual track for that given event, if we have time. When you're in the racetrack itself and you're trying to set up your car, doing videos and trying to show a how-to is really difficult to do, but I might be able to do an audio over some of the video that we'll film there. So we'll see how that goes. This is a race weekend actually as we speak up here in Canada, but I'm not going. I've got family commitments elsewhere that are more important. But that's the first segment here, and we'll go on to the second segment of part 2 later. Okay? So thanks for watching.